Hello, gremlins! I have a schedule of videos I want to make, planned all the way until November, but occasionally I have an idea sparked by a random conversation about a Tumblr post, and the entire schedule gets moved around so I can make a poster of different variations of Gryphons in the style of one of those educational posters of animal species. And then I decided to put all those Gryphons on a t-shirt as well. So welcome to my obsession with Gryphons, and a bunch of lore I created about a bunch of made-up species. Before I got started on the actual poster drawing, I spent a while figuring out what combinations of animals to turn into Gryphons, and then I spent a while on Wikimedia Commons finding fair use photographs of all the animal species I needed as references. My only rule for choosing species to mash together was to have a bird for the head and front legs and a mammal for the back legs, and in general, I tried to keep the two species thematically linked. For instance, having a pigeon and a rat combined into a Gryphon. When I finished the sketches, I sadly had to abandon one of my Gryphon species ideas, and added the rule that the two species had to be proportionally matched, either both very vertical or both very horizontal species. Trying to blend an otter and a penguin did not work. I didn't just decide on random species to mash together, I also came up with common and scientific names for each Gryphon I created. And before I even started on the sketches, the conversation that sparked this whole idea involved figuring out how on Earth Gryphons would work physiologically, evolutionarily, and historically. I am not a zoologist. Most of what I know about taxonomy and animal biology is from random research I don't remember well, and absorbing facts from the bearded gremlin, who is also not a zoologist, but has had multiple animal-related hyperfixations. I don't often draw animals, and I almost never make drawings that are entirely animal-based, but with the reference images I found online, it wasn't as hard as I thought it might be. It helps that these are made-up creatures, so if there are any elements that look proportionally incorrect, I can just say that the Gryphon works different to the species it looks like. Obviously, in real evolution, a Gryphon, as they appear in myths, could not exist. However, pretending that this would be possible in another world where Gryphons are just another genus of animal, how would they come to be? Brainstorming with the bearded gremlin, we came up with the idea that Gryphons, having both bird and mammal traits, evolved from the moment where reptiles and birds began to become mammals during the Permian period when synapsids, the early ancestor to all mammals, were evolving. Gryphons evolved fur like mammals did, but they maintained their reptilian scales, which turned into feathers, and the ability to lay eggs. The reason that Gryphon species all look like a blend of two pre-existing mammal and bird species is a very strange case of convergent evolution, where two animals whose common ancestors split millions of years ago end up separately evolving the same traits. Usually, I believe, convergent evolution leads to things like insects, birds, and bats all having the ability to fly while having completely different mechanisms to do so. However, in this case, convergent evolution made the Gryphons look nearly identical to other species. The reason for this is unknown, but it is the reason that Gryphons are treated as mythical beasts and believed to be magical. Gryphons are found all over the world, and there are many more species than just the ones I'm depicting here. These are just a few of the species I figured would be interesting. I started my lineup with a combination of a crow and a raccoon, which was also the example Gryphon species in the Tumblr post that inspired this project, which I've linked in the description. I named this species the Western Corvid Gryphon, and its scientific name is Gryphus corviloda. All the scientific names I invented for this project had the genus Gryphus, and the species name is a mashup of either the genus or the species name of the two animals that are blended to create the Gryphon. In this case, it was a crow, genus Corvus, and a raccoon, Procyon lotor. The next Gryphon I outlined is a combination of an Australian possum and a sulfur-crested cockatoo. Originally, I was going to combine an opossum and a pigeon, but decided that a pigeon was much better paired with a rat, and that as an Australian, I should represent at least one Australian combination. This created the sulfur-crested Gryphon, or Gryphus cacatu volpeca. Given the species I combined into this Gryphon, the sulfur-crested Gryphon would be very loud and obnoxious and like nesting in people's roofs. Next comes the common barn Gryphon, native to both Europe and North America, but it has spread globally due to people keeping it as an exotic pet. This Gryphon, scientific name Gryphus tytophilus, is a combination of a barn owl and a domestic cat, specifically an orange cat to match the owl's coloring. It hunts small birds and rodents, as well as another species of Gryphon, the brown field Gryphon, which I draw next. The brown field Gryphon, or Gryphus maluru troglodytes, is a combination of a wood mouse and a house wren. It is the smallest Gryphon species known to scientists, and while it too is native to Europe and North America, it is spread as a pest to every continent except Antarctica. It is generally harmless, but in large flocks it can damage crop harvests, so people try to keep their numbers down, often by using barn Gryphons the way cats have been used against rats and mice in history. The first few Gryphons I drew were all fairly small species, but now I get to some of the larger Gryphons, a little more impressive looking. Next, I outlined the Great American Gryphon, Gryphus buteolupus, which appears to be a mix of a grey wolf and a red-tailed hawk. Like the grey wolf, the Great American Gryphon was hunted to near extinction by colonists until conservation methods began to be introduced. The Great American Gryphon survived in isolated pockets where humans cannot easily reach, and in recent decades have begun to spread back to their old ranges, in national parks and preserves and in the Canadian wilderness. They're still a rare sight, but their numbers are growing. Next, I drew the African scavenger Gryphon, Gryphus ruepe crocata, a combination of a spotted hyena and a Ruppel's vulture. This Gryphon is a scavenger, as its name suggests, living in the savannas of sub-Saharan Africa. In packs, it can hunt prey of its own, but it prefers to scavenge the remains of other animals' hunts, circling in the sky around a recent kill until the predator that killed it is gone. This Gryphon is often seen as ugly and a bad omen, but it plays an important role in the ecosystem. Back to the small and numerous Gryphons, the next Gryphon is a combination of a pigeon and a rat, possibly the most thematically perfect combo I used. This is the common lesser griffin, Gryphus columbaratus, but is often just called the rat griffin. The rat griffin has spread to every continent, originating in Eurasia, and is the griffin best adapted to living with human populations without being domesticated, meaning it is one of the most common griffins to see. In modern times, hundreds of thousands of rat griffins live in modern cities, roosting in buildings and parks and eating trash and scraps off the streets. These griffins are usually seen as pests, but can be kept as pets and are very friendly. I left the most iconic griffin for last, the classic combination of lion and eagle, which I named the Great Eurasian Griffin, or Gryphus aquilio. Given that the myth of griffins originated in the Mediterranean, with some of the early writings mentioning griffins being from ancient Greek writers, I decided that the Great Eurasian Griffin is a combination of a lion species that used to live in Europe and a golden eagle. Lions existed in Europe during ancient times, vanishing from some areas as late as the Middle Ages, although most European lions seem to have gone extinct in the late BCs and early ADs, according to a quick Wikipedia search. Griffins were at risk of extinction for the same reasons, being a popular animal for gladiator fights and status symbols, but due to their ability to fly and reach territories humans cannot access, they survived in small numbers and began to spread again after the fall of the Roman Empire. While most concentrated in the Mediterranean, Eurasian griffins have also been found in Western Europe, Central Asia, and North Africa. I made myself a set color palette for this drawing so that all the final colors would look unified. I did my best to figure out what colors I'd need based on the species I was combining, then drew circles of those colors in a semi-transparent layer on top of a layer of brown, to give each color some brown undertones. I then, in order to expand my color palette slightly and give myself more shade range, added a blur to my colors so that the edges of each shade blend together. This worked really well to give myself a unified but not too limited set of colors, and I will be using this method again in the future. I started coloring with the Western corvid griffin, so I get to talk more about the facts and behaviors I've invented for each species. The corvid griffin is native to North America, and for most of history lived in woodlands. It has an omnivorous diet, eating insects, small animals, fruit, nuts, and berries. This varied diet meant that when wilderness got taken over by cities, the corvid griffin adapted quite well, and now many corvid griffins live off people's trash. Some people find corvid griffins very cute and endearing, others treat them as pests. The corvid griffin was very simple to draw, with a black feathered front and grey hind legs. Its tail is bushy with rings of dark and light grey, and its talons and feet are dark. Next, I began to colour the sulphur-crested griffin, which has a much higher contrast between its feathers and back legs. The sulphur-crested griffin is native to Australia, the only marsupial griffin I drew today, although I am open to finding out what I can blend with an emu in the future. It still lays eggs like all griffins, but instead of building a nest, the eggs are kept safe in the griffin's pouch, and the babies hatch very tiny and helpless, staying in the pouch for up to half a year. Sulphur-crested griffins live in both bushland and urban environments, and are omnivorous, eating mostly fruit and insects and occasionally lizards. They have white feathers with yellow on their wings and a yellow crest on their heads, which get raised up in mating dances. Their fur colour ranges from light to dark brown, and usually has a dark tail tip. The brown field griffin is all shades of light brown, meant for hiding in dry grass or under bushes. The field griffin eats nuts, fruits, grains, and insects, and makes nests in fields to hide in and sleep. While most brown field griffins live outside, in fields and woodlands, they do sometimes make their way into human houses, living under floorboards or in walls and attics. Humans don't tend to appreciate the company. The common barn griffin is the creature I was most careful about colour matching the two halves. Other griffins do have well-matched colours, but for the barn griffin it was intentional. Its feathers have the white and orange colouring of a barn owl, and its hind legs have the same colouring, that of an orange house cat. Barn griffins can come in a variety of colours, looking like different owls and cats. In the wild they live in forests, silently hunting rodents and small birds, and in human communities they are often pets. In history, they were domesticated to control rodent populations in farmland and cities, but now often they are just companion animals. The common barn griffin is the first griffin I coloured where the colouring is a little more complex than a single solid colour in each outlined section. I added speckles of orange to the white feathers on the head and the underside of the wings, and patches of white on the back paws. Next comes the Great American Griffin, another griffin with more complex colouring to match the patterns on the red-tailed hawk. While many griffins are omnivorous, the Great American Griffin eats only meat. It can hunt from both the air and from the ground, depending on the prey it's after. From the air, it will swoop down on rabbits, fawns, and squirrels, but more often it will hunt herds of deer on foot, using its wings to propel itself faster, occasionally taking flight for short distances to gain ground. The Great American Griffin is a pack animal, so in some hunts, some griffins will hunt from the air, while others drive the prey into open ground. The Great American Griffin has patches of pale beige in its brown feathers, especially on the wings, and its hind legs are grey. It has yellow talons and beak, and amber eyes. I believe that for every other griffin thus far, I've started colouring with the feathered top half, then coloured the hind legs afterwards. However, with the African scavenger griffin, I went the opposite direction, starting with the brown back legs. The African scavenger griffin also lives in packs, although the packs are small, half a dozen adults at the largest. They nest on bluffs where the hot updrafts of wind can help them take flight, and after a large meal, often they cannot fly at all. The front half of an American scavenger griffin is dark, with a few patterns on the wings, and with a long, bald neck that can be stuck into a carcass to eat without getting gore on feathers. The back half is spotted with a short tail and powerful legs for running. The common lesser griffin, also known as the rat griffin, is perhaps the most colourful griffin I've drawn, with iridescent patches of green and purple feathers at its neck. Rat griffins have a huge colour variety within their species, both of the feathers and their fur. Pure white rat griffins are perhaps the most respected and the most desired as pets. Their fur can be white, all shades of grey and brown, all the way to black, and their feathers often have very unique designs of black and grey, as well as the colour around their neck. This common lesser griffin has stripes on its wings. Finally, I coloured the Great Eurasian Griffin, which has rust brown feathers and tan fur. Also, I'll note here that the design for this griffin will significantly change after I think I'm done with the colouring. I wasn't happy with the wings from the start, because the reference photo I used was at a different angle to every other part of the body. However, I ignored the problem until the bearded gremlin pointed it out to me, and after I realised the problem was visible to other people, I redrew the wings and recoloured large sections of the body, and it was the right choice. Before any of that, though, I added a few layers on top of my art to give it some more texture, to look more like an illustrated poster and less like a cartoon. I then typed out all the common and scientific names and added a blurb about Griffin as a genus in the upper corner. This is a large document, A3 size, since I want to be able to print it in high quality someday, but this did mean a lot of these changes took over 10 minutes at a time to load, so I'm speeding through all the small alterations way quicker than it actually took to make them. And here's the finished poster! I put the digital version of this poster on my Etsy store. I don't have the means to print it myself, but if you want a copy, you can absolutely buy the digital file and print it. It should be able to be printed on any size paper up to A3 and maintain its quality. And now we come to the second half of the video, where I make all these designs again, but with acrylic paint on a t-shirt. I did start this process by making a second digital file where I arranged all the griffins into a pattern to paint, although when I actually started painting I didn't end up following this guide. My first step, of course, was to sketch every griffin. There was no way I was freehanding this design. I sketched the griffins with a brown watercolour pencil, since in the past a watercolour pencil has worked great on t-shirts, washing right out after the design is painted. However, I've only used this method on dark t-shirts, since I think this might be my first time painting on fabric this light, and it turns out the watercolour pencil doesn't completely come out. I'm sure after a few washes it will fade, and most of the sketch is covered by my paint, so it's fine, but it is something to be aware of if you follow my methodology. While working on the digital art, I coloured each species one at a time. When working with wet paint, that isn't the most efficient method. Instead, I worked from top down, painting one section of a griffin then moving on to the next, so I wouldn't be at risk of smudging my wet paint. When using physical paint, my way of keeping all the colours in harmony is to create a base shade and mix a little of that shade into every other paint colour I use. In this case, the base shade was a mix of burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, and white, to make a nice golden brown. All my colours ended up a little darker than the digital version. I think both my paint dries dark, and I was mixing darker colours since I'm used to those colours needing to show up against a darker background. Since I'm sure this video is already long, I cannot be stopped when I start info dumping about my world building. I'm speeding through the painting fairly quickly. I've already shared most of my Griffin world building anyway. I will say that I'm imagining both the poster and the t-shirt as souvenir items a person could buy at either a museum or a nature park in a world where these species exist. Given that I'm using paint rather than Photoshop, I've added a little bit more shading to my art than the poster has. Mostly this is because my natural painting style is more shaded than block colours, but it's also because I'm not adding the black outlines until the final step, so I need the shading to differentiate leg from body, and it makes the Griffins look more dynamic anyway. I think I've mentioned before in 2 other videos I've made about Griffin-related art, but in case you couldn't tell by how long I've been yapping, I love Griffins. They are probably my favourite non-humanoid mythical creature, and have been for years, since I was at least 11 or 12. When I was a kid, I pretended to be a worker in a magical game reserve for fantasy creatures, and my specialty was griffins. I'm pretty sure I talked about that particular made-up world and character I pretended to be on the channel before, a while ago, and I'll link the video in the cards if you are interested in more of my urban fantasy magical creature world building. A lot of the time during the painting process, I would work one colour at a time, adding a little extra paint to slightly change the shade as I went. For instance, when I had my grey paint mixed, I painted the Great American Griffin's wolf legs, the Scavenger Griffin's neck and beak, almost all of the Rat Griffin, and the Corvid Griffin's fur, among other details. I finished the entirety of the Great Eurasian Griffin first, which felt fitting as the classic Griffin and the Griffin I left for last through most of the digital process. Most of this process went very smoothly, other than dropping tan paint onto the shirt almost immediately, which I couldn't quite wash out. The harder sections to work on were the dark sections, just because my paints were already turning darker than the digital version, and trying to make the darks stand out without just being black was going to be tricky. There are places on the Corvid Griffin and the Scavenger Griffin where the outlines are actually lighter in shade than the internal colours. Those 2 Griffins were the second 2 I finished in entirety, although I did forget the spots on the Scavenger Griffin until the outlining stage. Light colours can also be a challenge, because the shirt itself is light and I didn't want to accidentally match the fabric colour. The first light colours I used in the design I worked on were the feather details on the Great American Griffin, but the first challenge area was the sulphur-crested Griffin, which turned out fine. The common barn Griffin, however, I tried to change the white up a little bit to differentiate it, and accidentally made it look like very pale skin. I ended up going over the feathers with a bit of pale yellow to try and nullify the accidental pink tones. While working on the common barn Griffin after finishing the Great American Griffin, my phone ran out of storage space, so suddenly we cut to all the Griffins being done except for the outlines. Now comes the tricky bit. Normally when outlines are involved in my art, they are drawn first, and then I colour within the lines. Now though, I need to follow the edges of my colours with thin outlines exactly, and not mess up. I mixed a shade of paint that is mostly black, but with some brown tones in it to make it match the rest of the very brown design, and not be too intense. The shade is a bit too close to the dark tones in some of the Griffins to stand out, but it works everywhere else. I started from the top so I wouldn't smudge my paint, and began to carefully outline the Great Eurasian Griffin. As much as I was very scared to mess up this process, outlining worked surprisingly well. It was easier to outline on top of the paint than on the edges where the fabric would absorb all the paint off my brush, and I had to make sure to wipe my brush often so the lines wouldn't become thick and lumpy. The design was looking good before the outlines, but I think the outlines really elevate it and make all the details pop. I didn't outline every color variation, most of the feather modeling just stayed as color, but I did add outlines to differentiate feathers in the wings. The final step was a step I wasn't actually sure I would do. For most of the process, I figured the graphic on this t-shirt would just be the Gryphons, but near the end I decided I wanted to write down their names the same way I did on the poster. I mixed some more dark brown, nearly black paint and got my thinnest brush and began to very carefully write out each species' common name. My handwriting is tolerable when I go slow, although I almost never write slowly, but here I was very focused on making the lettering look good. When I'd written all the common names, I decided I'd write the scientific names as well, and had to figure out how to handwrite italics. I think I did a pretty good job, and I just really hope I spelled everything right. Then, all that was left to do was wait for the shirt to dry, iron it very carefully to set the paint, and film some reveal footage. Ta-da! I am so happy with this shirt. I've already worn it once out. The one problem is that I once again made the design go too low, so when I wear it tucked into pants, the bottom couple of Gryphons get a bit cut off, but that's fine. I'm so happy with it. I'm a little bit worried that the text might not be super sustainable. Like, I'm worried that because it's such detailed painting, that'll be the first thing to go once it's been washed a few times. But also that almost kind of adds to the charm. Like, if I'm trying to make it look like it's the kind of t-shirt that you would get in like a museum or like at a national park or something, then having it, you know, a couple summers old with some of the text faded off, that also fits the vibe. So yeah, I'm really happy with this shirt. I'm really happy with all the Griffin lore I created in this video. I had a lot of fun basically world building out this whole world where Gryphons exist and evolved alongside other animals that just are that way for some reason. And I would happily continue info dumping about other mythical creatures and how I think they could fit into our world if I'm given the opportunity. I love this stuff. I love pretending that fantasy elements can exist in this world. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm sure that by the time I finish editing this will be a fairly long video because it's two very distinct halves, both with a full, fairly intensive project in them. But I had fun. Anyway, until next time, bye!